This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Hello, it is Ryan, and we could all use an extra bright spot in our day, couldn't we? Just to make up for things like sitting in traffic, doing the dishes, counting your steps, you know, all the mundane stuff. That is why I'm such a big fan of Chumba Casino. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere with daily bonuses. That should brighten your day a little. Actually, a lot. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com. That's ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
It's time for today's Lucky Land horoscope with Victoria Cash.
Life's gotten mundane, so shake up the daily routine and be adventurous with a trip to Lucky Land. You know what they say, your chance to win starts with a spin. So go to LuckyLandSlots.com to play over 100 social casino-style games for free for your chance to redeem some serious prizes. Get lucky today at LuckyLandSlots.com.
Available to players in the U.S., excluding Washington and Michigan. No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 18+. Terms and conditions apply.
We made this.
Doing good. Welcome to the Japan on Film podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and today I am welcoming a new guest, and that is Ian Buckley. Ian, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So before we dive into the movie for today, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name's Ian. I'm a fellow podcaster on the We Made This podcast network. I do cover Star Wars, Star Trek, primarily focused on the kind of like sci-fi fantasy element of pop culture. I do also do a lot of podcasting about movies. My largest kind of podcast is Illumination Above All, which is a podcast discussing the Apple TV show Severance. That is currently on hiatus between season 1 and 2, both the show and the podcast. But we will be coming out with some new episodes this coming year in between season 1 and 2, as we anticipate getting, now that the actors and writer strikes are over, more news about production picking back up, and we'll have some actual things to talk about again. And yeah, we also have, like I mentioned, Star Trek coverage. We Are Starfleet is the Star Trek show that I'm one of the hosts of, and I also have an occasionally updating Star Wars podcast called The Way. So I tend to keep myself busy all over the network.
Cool. So what got you into podcasting in the first place?
I've always been a podcast listener, say always, but honestly, yeah, I've been listening to some podcasts of mine for 15 years or more. That's kind of a long time when I think about the span of my life and consuming a particular kind of media. And so I've kind of, I don't know, grown into adulthood with this format. And a few years back, the head of the We Made This network, Tony Black, was kind of putting the bat signal up on, I think it was Reddit at the time, about looking for co-hosts for a Star Trek podcast he was hoping to start up. That turned into eventually We Are Starfleet with myself, Mike Slammer at the time. He's also one of the co-hosts, and now we have 2 additional co-hosts, Ashley Thomas and Craig McKenzie. So there's 4 of us now on that show.
Awesome. Very cool. And so we are the Japan on Film podcast, so we're focused on Japanese movies. What's kind of your history with Japanese cinema?
So I think like a lot of kids grown up in the 90s, my first exposure to Japanese cinema was through Godzilla. And actually just saw the most recent Godzilla movie a couple days ago. Highly recommended. I had a blast with it.
I still got to see it.
That movie has no right looking as good as it does on the budget that it had. Some of the CGI is a little janky, like don't look too closely at the water when ships or Godzillas are moving through it. But honestly, it has no right to look as good as it does on that budget. And it has an actual, effective human story,
Hmm.
and the marriage of the two is hard to resist. I think they did a pretty great job with it. And then, as I grew into adulthood and started getting interested in film as like an art form that I
Hmm.
was considering a little bit more seriously, I discovered, like a lot of people, Kurosawa and Ozu and Mizoguchi to a lesser extent, but got into the kind of the classics
Hmm.
of Japanese cinema for a while, got more into anime for a while, and yeah, Kurosawa remains one of my guys. If I get an opportunity to see a film of his that I haven't seen
Hmm.
in the theaters before, I jump on it. That was the case with Redbeard. I had seen the movie many years ago. I'd always really liked it, even loved it,
Hmm.
but I had never gotten a chance to see it in the theaters until just last year when I had the chance to catch a Mifune Kurosawa retrospective in New York City, and it just something about seeing the movies on the big screen just makes them grow in my estimation,
Hmm.
and it kind of like rocketed to the top of my favorite Kurosawa movies after that experience. So yeah, I've loved Japanese film broadly, but I'll admit, it's been narrowly focused on the kind of the bigger names
Hmm.
in Japanese film. So I've loved it for a long time. I've loved Kurosawa for a long time. I've loved this movie for almost 20 years now, and I'm excited to talk about it.
Awesome. Great. So whenabouts did you first discover this movie in particular? Because you'd said you'd watched some Kurosawa stuff. Where kind of did this fall in your watching history with
So
Kurosawa?
this was pretty early. It definitely wasn't like one of the first four or five that I saw, but it was not that long after. I think I started, as a lot of people do, at one point. Criterion Collection put out this four movie box set of like Kurosawa's samurai
Hmm.
cinema, and it was Seven Samurai, Yojimbo Senjuro, and Hidden Fortress. And I bought that box set and I watched all of those. Rashomon was actually the first Kurosawa that I had seen, and then I immediately bought that box set, and those were like the first five that I saw.
Hmm.
And then I think the next two were probably Ron and Redbeard.
Yeah.
And then I saw High and Low somewhere in that. Like that first year that I discovered these movies, I
Hmm.
saw about eight of them. I saw
Okay.
like a lot of the big ones.
Hmm.
And then only kind of revisited a few of them over and over again through the years. I mean, I've seen Yojimbo and Senjuro a dozen times. I
Hmm.
love those movies. Got a chance to see those in theaters. Ron, I'll watch anytime. And this one now has become one that I return to over and over again, and I find a lot of comfort in.
Hmm.
It makes me feel good. It certainly makes me feel a lot better than when I watch Ron. And I think I've always felt a strong emotional connection to this one,
Hmm.
as opposed to a lot of the others. I feel emotions in terms of excitement and admiration for like the filmmaking,
Hmm.
and I'm intellectually engaged. But this one is the one that consistently moves me like
Hmm.
to tears,
Hmm.
and so it's one that I keep returning to.
Okay, great. Now, my history with this is just last night. This is the first time I've seen this movie. But you know what is
Sure.
funny is I think something about the name, something about the image of Mifune on the cover. I honestly always thought this was a samurai movie. And then when I picked it up,
Sure.
when you said you wanted to talk about it, I picked it up and I'm just like, oh, it's not about samurais at all. Okay, that's complete.
Nope.
But yeah, that was and I looked on Letterbox before to see what other people had said about this, and a few other people had said the same thing, that they had always thought this was a samurai movie before they watched it. So, but it's interesting because it does combine a few different of these things. I think it's kind of fitting that this was Kurosawa's A, it was his last black and white movie, and B, it was the last movie he made with Mifune, because a lot of the kind of stuff that he became known for does kind of all get wrapped up in this movie. You've got the period piece setting, which he's known for with a lot of his samurai stuff. You've got the obviously collaboration with Mifune again, but also dealing with this kind of like social criticism of the ineffectiveness of government at the time, and that kind of, and like, these kind of class divisions, which is stuff that he kind of explored a little bit in Ikiru. And then you've also got this very humanist tale at the heart of the movie. So it does combine these different things that he was kind of working on his entire career up until that point.
Yeah, it's a real transitional film for him for the reasons you mentioned, but it does touch on these themes that he's explored several times in his career. His attitude has definitely, I think, changed noticeably since Ikiru, especially. Like, you
Hmm.
watch that movie and, like, you watch Redbeard and you listen to the things that Redbeard says in the movie, and, you get a sense that if Kurosawa was making a story like Ikiru, it might, like, a government bureaucrat might not be the hero.
Hmm.
He seems to have become a lot more cynical about the role of government in its ability to elevate and um, take care of a
Hmm.
population.
Yeah.
And he seems to focus a lot more on finding meaning in the struggle of ordinary people to achieve good in this chaotic and cruel world that seems to want to crush them at every turn.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm not sure when this fell in. I'm trying to double check. Do you remember when his suicide attempt was?
So it was definitely between this and Kagemusha, but
Okay.
I'm not sure exactly when.
Yeah, because you said about, you're talking about the kind of change in his thinking between Ikido and this one. I think I definitely saw that as well. Like, he does seem a bit more cynical in this one as opposed to in Ikido, where he definitely felt like there was a little bit more promise for government's ability. And I think a lot of that has to do with, stuff he was seeing at the time, like I'm just, basically pulling this out of just out of my brief understanding of like the 60s period, but that was a time when you saw a lot of this kind of growing social unrest in Japan, and people were kind of clamoring to try and make things better than it was before. But you had a lot of the same people who were in charge during the war being in charge after the war, and a lot of those same policies and ideas still being continued up until that day. So I think there's a definite cynicism he probably had when he was making this movie.
Yeah, especially compared to, like, his earlier work, and like Ikiru came out, like, the war had been over for 6, 7
Hmm.
years, and now it's like 20 years later, and he's getting a lot less patient with the idea of the government will fix anything
Yeah,
for us.
yeah. So one of the things that stood out to me as well, and this is going to sound completely incongruous, but have you ever watched the TV show Scrubs?
Oh, love it. Yeah.
So I get a lot of Dr. Cox vibes off of Redbeard in this.
Yes, that's a great comparison. Yes, the kind of, like, gruff, hard on the outside,
Hmm.
can't really understand his methods or his means of communication, and then you realize that there's a method to all of it, that he actually cares very, very deeply.
Hmm.
He just has no patience for bullshit. And
Right.
when this young doctor first comes to his hospital, he is full of so much bullshit.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That was one of, and just like that ending scene too, when the two doctors are walking together, and the young doctor, whose name I'm suddenly blanking on, Yasumoto, blanked on just for a minute.
Yasumoto,
Yeah,
yeah.
um, always happens at the worst possible moment. But when he's walking with them in that last scene, and he's telling him, he's like, "This is gonna be it. This is gonna be hard work. You're gonna regret this. You're not gonna want to do it." And it's just like it's like his own bizarre way of saying thank you, because he can't just do it himself.
Right. Yeah. No, it's this very it, it does remind you of the kind of Dr. Cox JD thing. There
Hmm.
can't be this honest communication of I really appreciate your commitment and your sacrifice to doing this. It's got to be this you're going to be miserable, you're
Hmm.
going to hate it.
Yeah.
This is a terrible decision. You're going to regret this.
Yeah. And well, just like, just how tough he is, like, when he's fighting off those those guys when they're trying to rescue the girl from the brothel. Like that's another aspect of just like, even more so than Dr. Cox, because Cox always talked about that stuff, but we never really saw him get very physical. Here, Redbeard can throw down.
Yeah, I love that even in this like thoughtful, methodically paced, like deep philosophical movie, there's still got to be a classic Kurosawa Mifune action scene right smack in the middle before intermission.
And what were some of the things that really kind of jump out at you that make this movie you keep coming back to?
Um, I think I I've always enjoyed it on its technical merits,
Mm-hmm.
and I've also always found it like I find it entertaining. Like, yes, it's a little bit long, and no, I don't think like in terms of narrative, like every single thing in the movie is like working for me
Mm-hmm.
100%. We'll get into that. But so much of it I find effective on a purely emotional level to a larger extent than I think any other certainly, that I've seen so far of Kurosawa's films. I think I've only seen maybe half of them.
Mm-hmm.
So, 14, 15 or so. He made like 30.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's possible that there's others out there that I haven't seen yet that will, you know, rise to the level of like emotional effectiveness
Mm-hmm.
that this movie does for me. But I think also as I've gotten older, it's one that when I revisit, like it affects me more
Mm-hmm.
and in different ways than when I was younger. Like when I first saw this movie and I watched the scene of Yasumoto, bearing witness to this old man dying of cancer. It was an effective scene. It's beautifully shot, and
Mm-hmm.
it's horrifying, and it's moving in an abstract way. But I've now had the experience in my life of being with my father while he died of cancer in a hospital bed, and
Yeah,
now
same here.
I cannot experience that
Mm-hmm.
scene without going back to that place and to find new veins of deep emotional truth in this film,
Mm-hmm.
that I've known for 20 years. I think is one of the reasons why it keeps climbing in my estimation,
Mm-hmm.
because there are other ones of Kurosawa's films that like I've come back to, have revisited, and I admire. Seven Samurai is a perfect example.
Yeah.
Love that movie. It's an extraordinarily influential movie. But every time I watch that movie, I feel like I'm getting less out of the experience. I
Mm-hmm.
realize that sounds like weird to say, like it's a masterpiece, it's Seven Samurai, but like I feel like every time I watch this movie, I get something more out of it,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel like it's grown with me in a way that many of his other films haven't, as much as I still admire them greatly.
No, I think that's
Um,
totally fair. That totally makes sense. I mean, there are going to be those movies that speak to us on one level or another, and it's got nothing. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with technical achievement or creativity or anything like that. It's just like the ones that hit you at the right emotional moment in your life, and then they end up sticking with you because of that. And
yeah,
um, and there's no telling what that movie's going to be, right? It could be something like
right,
it could be something like Redbeard. It could be something like, I don't know, Happy Gilmore, right? You never know what
right.
this will be for to hit someone at that right point. I mean, for me, one of those movies is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, because talking about the father thing, that
Sure.
was the last movie my
Yeah,
father and I watched together in the theater, and then he died about like a year or
yeah,
two after we saw it. So that movie has a special resonance with me just because of that shared memory and that shared truth between that link between that movie, which is all about fatherhood, and it being the
right.
movie that I experienced with my father.
Absolutely. And so much of Kurosawa's work, like in Ikiru, is about like how to be a good person. What
Hmm.
is it to be a good person? What is it to know what the right thing to do is and then do it in an increasingly chaotic and hard to navigate world. And I think that that is one of the themes that this movie has that I keep wanting to come back to in a
Hmm.
world that seems increasingly hard to understand. Is it's about good people in impossible circumstances trying to do the most good in the world that they can, like
Hmm.
trying to do everything that's in their power, like to learn how to do the most good in the world and then actually do it. These are themes that I feel like unfortunately are always going to be relevant, and they're also themes that I feel increasingly like I have to come back to and revisit for my own sanity.
Yeah, definitely. And there's so much of that stuff in this movie, like just like dealing with the kind of impossible situations. I think that's why maybe I think I like Ikiru a little bit more than this movie, because in a lot of ways, like Ikiru, I can watch it and I can feel good about what I'm watching because there feels like a definite push to make things better. But I watch a movie like this and I just get so angry at the situation that these people find themselves in. And just like and
Yeah.
I know the whole point of the movie is that you're watching these that you're supposed to watch these doctors struggle in this situation. You're supposed to understand how difficult their life is. And I think that's maybe almost too effective because it just ends up making me very angry at the situation.
Yeah, and I think it's reflective of Kurosawa's frustration and
Mhm.
anger at a world and at a society that he felt increasingly unable to, um, in which he felt it was increasingly impossible to effect meaningful change
Mhm.
on a large systemic level, which is where he saw all of these problems. I mean, Redbeard himself says in this film, like half the people here wouldn't be sick if they weren't poor.
Yeah.
Like if poverty, like if poverty wasn't a thing, if we took meaningful action to eradicate or ameliorate at the very least widespread
Mhm.
poverty, there'd be just much less illness. And so many of these illnesses are illnesses of the impoverished, and treatable things
Mhm.
that someone of means can sort of take for granted, and maybe they can have a doctor like Redbeard come to their estate and treat them, and they'll have an affliction that only affects people who eat too much, who
Mhm.
have too many resources, such as the government official that he visits in this film.
Right. Yeah.
And all of these people who have so little are just in this crushingly, yeah, depressing to watch situation. But I think that what gives me comfort when I do watch it is that extreme contrast. Like these people are so destitute,
Mhm.
and there's so little sunlight in their lives, and seeing how dedicated these people still are
Mhm.
to trying to doing their best to make some small difference. Like, don't get me wrong, Ikiru is right up there with me in
Mhm.
terms of like my favorite Kurosawa films for exploring a lot of the same thematic
Yeah.
ground.
Yeah.
But yeah, for some reason, it's that extreme contrast for me in this movie of things are so awful,
Mhm.
and yet they still do their
Yeah,
best.
yeah. And I think that's another thing that makes me angry about the situation in this movie because this movie was made in 1965. It was about a period in the 19th century, and now watching it, it's 2023, and at the time that we're recording this, and it's the exact same shit is still there, and it is very frustrating because it feels like we've almost been making things worse because now we've got the kind of extreme where we do have a situation where we literally could cure poverty if we were willing to do it, but we don't.
Right, right. Because it's hard. Because it's not easy,
Mhm.
and it's so much easier to do the other thing.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Now you talked about some points you want to criticize about this, and I want to get in that too. I mean, one of the things I think of, and this is both an admirable thing, and it's also kind of a thing that where I think Kurosawa's ambitions got a little bit of ahead of himself in this movie because he had spent so much on this movie and he had had these sets meticulously constructed to the point that they had actual period accurate medicine in the cabinets and they'd built
Yeah,
this whole
the
town.
drawers were full.
Yeah, the drawers were
It's
completely
crazy.
full.
The
Yes.
drawers were full.
And you fill the set with like the set was meticulously constructed with pieces that were actually around at that time period, so they wanted to get it as authentic as possible. Like he wanted to make sure that the interior of the hospital used the exact same kind of wood that they used back then. And honestly, there gets to a point where it's like, dude, tone it down a little bit. You don't need to be that accurate in it.
I don't disagree. I mean, as a film nerd, like I want to say, I love all that stuff. I love his impulse to want to do all of these things.
Mhm.
I feel like there is an element of obsessiveness
Mhm.
to some of his insistence on, like, to me, the line is like, you you don't have to have all those drawers actually full of
Mhm.
stuff. Really, truly, you don't need to do that. It doesn't need to be anybody's job. Some poor PA
Mhm.
has to fill every single one of these goddamn drawers with stuff that nobody is ever going to see. And I get that in his mind, like, there's something for, whether it's for the actors so that they just sort of instinctively kind of like know that they're in this place that is just so authentic, like they can just get into the space of these characters. I don't know. Like I'll be the first to admit I'm a little bit of a nerd
Mhm.
for thinking about like how cool that is in theory, but when it comes to the practicality of like this shoot, this production went on for so long.
Mhm.
Everyone got the flu twice.
Yeah.
Like Mifune was so turned off by the working conditions and Kurosawa's like immovability on some of these things,
Mhm.
and the fact that he had to turn down work. He turned down multiple
Many,
projects at
yeah.
the point in his career when
Yeah.
he was at the peak of his career,
Mhm.
and he had to turn it down for this film. And look, I'm going to say, as someone who loves this film, worth it. Whatever
Mhm.
you were going to do with those other directors wasn't going to be as good as what you did here. But I understand
Mhm.
the frustration, and I understand why it ended their relationship ultimately, their working relationship, and it seems their personal relationship as
Mhm.
well, unfortunately. But like, would I have rathered Kurosawa just been like a little bit more chill on this production and gotten a few more movies with Mifune under his belt? Yeah, of course I do.
Mhm.
Of course I wish that. Of course I think that like he went overboard with some of this stuff, but I do think there's like a little bit of strange filmmaking alchemy at work
Mhm.
when you do insist on that much authenticity. I think when it does appear on screen, as it does in a film like Ron, like he was
Mhm.
insistent on the specificity of like it has to be these dyes and these costumes have to be woven in these ways, and like that won an Academy Award for costuming. Like
Mhm.
it's spectacular, but all that stuff is seen on screen. The stuff that's in drawers that never gets seen, the alleys of this entire village that he reconstructed,
Mhm.
the alleyways and facades of buildings that are never once on screen. Like
Mhm.
you can't tell me that really truly adds to this film being as powerful as it is,
Yeah.
because it's powerful for all these reasons besides that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's obviously there's a degree of authenticity you want to strive for, like you said, to make the actors feel like they are in that place. And yeah, there's a definite feel to that. Like, for example, going to a historical site or something and seeing it in person versus just reading about it or seeing pictures of it. Like seeing it in person, there is a different feel to that. So yeah, I can definitely assume that would also affect the way that the actors perform in those types of situations, where if you can see the slats holding up the cardboard set, it's a little bit harder to get lost in the moment, as opposed to if it's a real
Right.
building you're in. So yeah, I could definitely understand that.
Right.
But yeah, there's also a moment when you're just like, lay off the PAs or some poor intern who's got to fill all these drawers up and then has
Yeah.
got to take it all down. Like there's a lot of stuff they had left over as a result of this stuff that was just never even photographed once. And so
Right.
y-
Yeah.
yeah,
Never used.
and yeah, and I think I side a little bit more with Mifune on that. I mean, I definitely understand where he's coming from, especially the whole fact about, it's not like actors in Japan aren't like actors in America, where like Tom Cruise could buy probably has several islands in his portfolio, but Mifune was more or less pretty much just a working actor, so he needed that work coming in. So yeah, I
Yeah.
think there's also and this is a problem that some of the greats have had, where you kind of feel like, and they're so amazing, but at the same time, I don't know if I'd want to meet some of them, because some of them seem like total assholes, and I get that
Some of
sense.
them seem like they could be intense to work with.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I could definitely see that with Kurosawa to a certain extent. I think like
Yep.
Kubrick, I think would have been a nightmare to know.
Yeah, Kubrick has the reputation of being in his personal life quite nice, but on set, very demanding.
Hmm.
Knows exactly what he wants. Kurosawa's the same way. It's like, nope. I have a laser focused vision of what this project needs,
Hmm.
on every single level. Very few directors think or work like that. And I think that the trade-off for anyone who works with these directors is that they know what they're getting in for.
Hmm.
Not that that excuses any kind of abuse or anything like that,
Right.
but I'm just saying that, like, you know that you're going to be choosing to work with a person who has a reputation for being difficult,
Hmm.
but that if you can get with the program, you're going to make some really timeless works of art
Yeah.
together. And that's why you see a lot of these people who say Kubrick is hard to work with, Kurosawa is hard to work with, yet they continue to work with them on project after project
Right.
for great lengths of their career.
Yeah.
Kurosawa worked with that costume designer, or the production designer on Ron, for like 30 years or
Hmm.
something. Like they were longtime
Well, yeah,
collaborators,
I mean, also
despite his
even
reputation.
yeah, even up until the end, I mean, Kurosawa and Mifune made 16, 17 movies together, so that
Yeah.
was obviously he had.
It is Ryan here, and I have a question for you. What do you do when you win? Like, are you a fist pumper, a woohooer, a hand clapper, a high fiver? I kind of like the high five, but if you want to hone in on those winning moves, check out Chumba Casino. At ChumbaCasino.com, choose from hundreds of social casino-style games for your chance to redeem serious cash prizes. There are new game releases weekly, plus free daily bonuses, so don't wait. Start having the most fun ever at ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void were prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
It's time for today's Lucky Land horoscope with Victoria Cash.
Life's gotten mundane, so shake up the daily routine and be adventurous with a trip to Lucky Land. You know what they say, your chance to win starts with a spin. So go to LuckyLandSlots.com to play over 100 social casino-style games for free for your chance to redeem some serious prizes. Get lucky today at LuckyLandSlots.com.
Available to players in the U.S., excluding Washington and Michigan. No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void were prohibited by law. 18+. Terms and conditions apply.
Been able to tolerate it to a certain degree up until that point, but I think by the time it got to Redbeard, he just kind of felt like he had reached his breaking point with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and he was at a very different point in his career
Yeah.
by then. Like, he was getting offers from Hollywood, he was getting offers from Europe. Like, he was not a, Japanese market only actor, and he didn't know how long that window was going to be open
Right,
for him.
right, yeah, yeah. And you mentioned some criticisms that you think about now. So, what were some of those that jumped out at you this time?
So I think for me the biggest thing from a narrative perspective is, I don't, look. I think this is one of Kurosawa's best. It certainly is one of my favorites, maybe even my favorite. But I have yet to watch a Kurosawa vehicle where I felt like the romance marriage angle was like the strongest element of any particular narrative for me. I mean, I think he has some post-war kind of neo-realist movies that he's done that have a little bit more, they have more women featured, but also like romance is a bit more of a focus. But I I don't know if maybe because this was in the original source material. I know the screenplay was adapted, from existing stories, but yeah, the Yasumoto, Masai romance that leads to the marriage at the end. That's the one element of this film that I never really lock into.
Hmm.
I never really it never really resonates as like this like emotionally true, deep, thing for me to connect to. Like all of these other really insightful moments of human, of philosophy and like human, society getting along, these like deep questions of what it means to be a good person in the world. All of that is really rendered effectively. And then to me, it just feels like there's just this tacked on marriage romance story that I've never really cared that much about. I don't know. I mean, I know some of it is about, the sort of traditional marriage structures at the
Right.
time, like to an American audience, especially in the 21st century. Like I look at some of this arranged marriage
Hmm.
stuff where like it doesn't work out with one sister, so you marry the other. Like okay, like I get it, different culture, different time, but it's just something that like I just can't relate to on any level. So it just really it's something that I struggle with in this film particularly.
I'd never thought about that as far as the romance angles go in Kurosawa's movies, but now that you articulate it out loud, that it just kind of rung a bell for me. And um, when I started thinking about it as you were saying, and I was having trouble thinking of any that were really effective romances as well. And I mean, I think the most effective one that I can think of is the one in Seven Samurai, and that's not even because of the characters at all. That's just more because of what that relationship is, how it reflects like the class attitudes at the time is really the more interesting thing. But as far
Right.
as like a relationship between two characters, you don't really know anything about that girl to understand whether or not she'd be a good match for the young samurai.
Yeah, no, and honestly, that to me is one of the things in Seven Samurai that I always get a little bit disinterested in. I've seen it now enough times that kind of whenever the romance plot is playing out, I'm kind of like I'm ready for the next thing. I
Hmm.
kind of don't want to watch it anymore. Like it's never something that in that movie I've been invested in. Now other people may disagree, but I just for me none of these relationships that have been featured in his films have ever really been the emotional core for me to any of the stories.
No, it almost feels like I'm not sure what his personal life was like as far as like marriage and anything like that. I'd known at one point, but it's been a while since I read up on that aspect of his
Same,
life.
yeah.
But doesn't strike me as someone who was, necessarily very good with the opposite sex or very good with romantic relationships in general. Like a lot of his movies, they seem to focus a lot more on um some kind of mentor student situation. Seems like more the relationship that he feels most interested in.
Yeah, that's a good point. He's very interested in exploring different kinds of interpersonal relationships, but they're not really the marriage relationships that we see explored in films like Ozu is all about relationships in his films, and it doesn't feel like Kurosawa focuses at least on the sort of romantic or familial relationships that some of the other filmmakers of his era were. It does seem like a lot of the times it's this mentor relationship, or sometimes you'll have like sibling
Hmm.
relationships, but it's not really a focus on the romance for
Yeah.
me. And I, yeah, I don't know whether that's because of, like you said, he's just not as comfortable with that material, or doesn't really feel like he has things to say about that element of the human condition, while he has all of these other things he wants to say.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's always struck a bit of a hollow chord for me whenever there's a romantic element in his
So
films.
he was married, and his wife died in '85. So that was years
Yeah.
after, and he has two children. So that's all I really know basically. But I'm not sure like how connected their relationship was. I mean, his brother died at a young age, and I think that really kind of had a big influence on
Yeah.
him as well.
Yeah,
Um,
that was a big relationship. He had kind of a mentor-mentee
right.
relationship with his older
So I
brother.
think maybe that might be one of the reasons why that's kind of like the type of interpersonal relationship he kinds to zero in on. Um, and also I think another reason is because he seems to be much more focused on the larger societal themes, and it could be that he didn't think of romantic love as something that was really providing much of a commentary on what was happening in society at the time. Because you go back and you look at Jimbo, you look at Seven Samurai, and you kind of watch these movies, or like this one too, like we were saying, and you try to watch it through the lens of the environment he was in at the time, and some of those societal themes start to come out a little bit more. And maybe he just felt that romantic love wasn't something that was giving him the kind of focus that he wanted for his themes.
Yeah, I mean the most notable marriages that I can think that he depicts are high and low, which is a fairly straightforward marriage, but it's also this kind of largely pretty traditional, like at least in 1960s Japan marriage,
Mhm.
and so like the focus is much more on Toshiro Mifune's character and what he's going through in that story, and like the wives in like Ron are especially the one is really important,
Mhm.
and Throne of Blood because it's Macbeth. Lady
Right.
Macbeth
Yeah.
is that marriage is important, but that is not a love story by any means.
Right.
So yeah, it doesn't feel like I get a lot of interest from Kurosawa in that side of human relations.
Yeah. But I also
At least in film.
no, yeah, absolutely. And I'd had this similar reaction to the romance in here. It didn't really do a whole lot for me, especially the and yeah, the because I did have a moment of thinking like, wait a minute, she's her sister. So what? I mean, and it did feel, but then I remembered, yeah, the time period of the time but still, I feel that the way that that story is resolved feels a little tacked on. Like it's the sister who
Yeah.
brings in the nuptial cups, and then he's like, "You're Chigusa, right?" She's like, "Yes." He's like, "How's your baby?" And then after that, they're like, "Oh, okay, everything's better now." It does feel like a very neat, pat little scene in there.
Yeah, and I get that like some of it is about like the tradition of the time, and like there's a lot of significance in just literally acknowledging someone's
Hmm.
existence in a circumstance like that with these complex social dynamics of the time. But I can't relate. I can't. I can intellectualize. I can intellectualize the relations of the time, like how these things had to play out.
Hmm.
But in terms of actually feeling like compelled by any of this interpersonal relationship stuff that was going on with them, like I'd much rather check back in with my friends at the hospital. Thank you very much. Like if we're gonna have this 3 hour story,
Hmm.
give me more of the hospital folks, and give me one more story of Yasumoto like learning how to be a decent person.
Hmm.
Like if that's if this is what we're if this is the epic of human society that we're getting from Kurosawa as his last film of this golden age of
Hmm.
his, then I'd rather see a little bit more of that and less of this that I frankly feel like is one of the things he doesn't do exceptionally well.
Yeah, and I feel like even for Kurosawa, it does kind of feel like he is a little bit anxious to get these scenes over and done with, like almost like he feels like he has to put them in some way, because it doesn't feel like he's very interested in making them very intriguing towards us.
Yeah, I feel like there's the least going on in terms of his personal philosophy being expressed, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's something that he is trying to express through his engagement with these sort of like more traditional marriage.
Hmm.
Like I don't know. I don't know if maybe there's some cultural context I'm missing, but it doesn't feel like he has as much to say about it as he does about all of these other things that we get to bear witness to.
Yeah.
And it does feel almost this rote kind of, well, we have to wrap this story up because we've already established that this when like we didn't really need to know. The audience never needed to know that this was an element of Yasumoto's past. Like
Hmm.
it gives some color to his character knowing that like he had this sort of this kind of life path that he thought he was going to be on, and it got disrupted, and that explains a little bit,
Hmm.
contextualizes a little bit like how he is the way he is when we start the story. But other than that, I really don't feel like it contributes that much to
Yeah.
our understanding of the character, to our understanding of what Kurosawa is trying to say about the human condition, and none of it is shot in a particularly dynamic or interesting way.
Well, I think,
So
yeah, I thought one of
yeah,
the things that would have made it more interesting would be to kind of see things more from Chigusa's perspective, because I mean, I don't know, I can't recall if it's ever actually stated, but I kind of got the sense that, Yasumoto is so focused on his career that maybe he was being neglectful of this woman, and then that's why she ended up going with this taking this lover.
Yeah, I would also like to have seen a little bit more. Like, if that was the subtext we were meant to get, then it was a little too sub.
Hmm.
It needed to be a little more text, I think.
And also the whole reasoning for Messiah, because I'm like, I don't know if I was in that situation and my one of my siblings got in a fight with their fiance because their fiance cheated on them or something like that. Like I wouldn't then go to that person and start up this kind of relationship at all. Like and again, that's probably more
Yeah,
the situation of the time. But again, I would like to. I'm more interested to see
exactly.
like what is Messiah thinking about that. Like this guy is the reason that my family's struggling right now. That my daughter can't come back, and it's and yeah, there's the part that's like, well, my sister did do this to on her own, but I feel like there would be some complicated emotions there, and it would be a little bit more interesting to see that aspect of it.
Yeah, like what on earth is going on Masai's side
Hmm.
of the road? Is like I get it that this her older sister, I presume it's her older
Yeah.
sister, like her calling off this and presumably arranged marriage was like a big scandal, and like her father cut her off, pretends she doesn't exist anymore,
Hmm.
but would like to acknowledge her existence again. Very kind of him, because she now has a child and he'd like to meet his grandchild again. Would be totally fine never talking to his daughter ever
Hmm.
again, but since she had a baby, he's willing to forgive her.
Hmm.
Again, like so much of this sort of attitude towards marriage and men and women, and like how much you know ownership the father figures seem to have over them, like it's all stuff that makes me feel so deeply uncomfortable
Hmm.
in as like a 21st century American dude, that like I just don't know how much of this story I could relate to, but if they gave me a little bit more of her perspective and a little bit more of a sense that she wasn't just like super happy about the way
Yeah.
all this turned out, like really, like like she seems enthusiastic, which again, like for someone as insightful as Kurosawa, just it feels like it rings extra false,
Hmm.
because I'm like, no, you're wiser than this.
Yeah.
Like like surely you have a little bit more insight than just, yeah, she's totally fine with this new arrangement. She's great. She's happy to have a new husband.
Yeah.
Happy to have a husband. It all feels so deeply strange in like a very kind of like I just don't quite I'm at an arm's length culturally from this perspective,
Hmm.
and I don't think that Kurosawa has done enough to bridge the gap.
No, definitely not. And yeah, I mean, it almost feels like in a weird way that she's kind of like a prize for Yasumoto coming out of this to being a good guy in the end. Like, and
It does have a little bit of that feeling of
yeah,
like, oh, you've been a good boy. Here's your cosmic reward for
yeah,
being a good person now.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That whole wedding scene is just like it made me feel uncomfortable in a lot of reasons for all these ways, and just the way it just kind of seems like maybe curls it honestly, and it does feel in some ways that maybe it that like, oh, we're already way over production, we got to kind of wrap this thing up now.
Yeah, it's like, "Oh, time to
Hmm.
go. Time to go, guys. Yeah, we've been at this for 2 years. It's time to go."
What were some other things that you wanted to talk about in this?
So, like, all criticism aside, like, it needs to be stated again that, like, that is all, like, for me, minor criticism that does not diminish how highly I esteem this film.
Hmm.
There are so many things about this, just the journey itself of an arrogant young doctor, who is this social and professional climber, who's so focused on his career
Hmm.
and his status, and the journey of that character into being an actual human being, dedicating his life to the service of healing others. It always moves me,
Hmm.
like that particular kind of hero's journey, the journey from being kind of shitty to being kind of good. Like, you mentioned a sitcom that I love, Scrubs. Another one, that I love is The Good Place, and
Hmm.
that is an entire like like metaphysical journey from being like different flavors of shitty people
Hmm.
to like these fully well-rounded, actualized human beings. And this has that same kind of journey, and
Hmm.
it's this like epic of the human soul, and it's not a action packed movie, although it has that great action
Hmm.
sequence in it. But it is a movie that has a lot of characters wrestling, of this particular character, especially wrestling with themselves,
Hmm.
and doing kind of psychic battle with their own, you know, with the shitty little parts of themselves that need to be addressed head on.
Right.
And that requires its own kind of bravery and its own kind of heroism.
Hmm.
So it's a little bit of a different view on what it means to be a hero than we get in some of Kurosawa's other films. But I love it so much because of how personal it is, and how he uses like his full arsenal of visual and sound techniques. This is a wonderful sounding movie too. Um, to tell the story. And so like there's all these striking like visual elements to it, like so many wonderful shots and sequences, and the lighting in especially the sequences where like Yasumoto is like tending to the dying man, or tending to this girl that they've rescued from a brothel. It's all these like very dimly lit scenes with like the faces and the eyes only lit and in close up, and these like the beads of sweat on the face. It's just like richly textured visual film,
Hmm.
and it has these moments like the with the dying man that I mentioned already. The young 12-year-old who they rescue from the brothel, she meets this little thief, this little friend of hers. And at one point his family all takes poison because of the shame that they've experienced at him being caught stealing. And she's at the side of her little friend, and he looks awful.
Hmm.
I mean, he genuinely, like, this little kid looks like, I don't know what they did makeup and lighting wise, but this little kid looks like he is about to die in real life.
Hmm. Yeah.
And it's so distressing to watch. It's so affecting, and seeing how much it's affecting her. And she has this moment where she runs out to scream down into this well,
Hmm.
and all these other women who work at the hospital are doing this too, the washerwomen. And they're all doing it to call his soul back from the afterlife,
Hmm.
to save his soul, to save his life. And he does survive. But the minute she hears that that's what they're doing, when she runs out and she screams down that well, I'm getting emotional just now thinking
Hmm.
about it. It's a moment that always really, uh, like, right to my chest it goes. And it's capped off with this incredible shot where the camera goes down into the well, and you see down in the water all the reflections, and there's no camera. I have no idea how he does this shot, but it's incredible. And so like I love the marriage so frequently in this movie of incredible technical achievement with really deeply resonant emotional moments.
Hmm.
And there's several things like that throughout the film. I could call out a few more, but like that's at its core, like those are the reasons why this movie means a lot to me,
Hmm.
why I love it so much.
Yeah, and that 12-year-old character you mentioned, Otoyo is her name.
Otoyo, yeah.
She was not part of the original story. So I think a lot of the criticism that we had about the Masai story, it might be more down to the original work, because you see how Kurosawa handles Otoyo, and it feels like he's much more invested in exploring her character and her situation, and that he doesn't really care about Masai and all that aspect of it.
Yeah, it almost feels like Masai is, she plays this role at one point when she delivers this fresh kimono to Otoyo, because she notices that they're tattered.
Hmm.
And Otoyo, recognizing that Masai and Yasumoto have some kind of connection, that she's potentially a romantic interest of his,
Hmm.
She's 12 years old. She's you know, as Redbeard pointed out, like she is at the point in her healing process, which is a very moving and insightful comment of his. She's at the point in her healing process where she's having these like normal 12-year-old feelings again. She's like becoming the young girl, turning young woman that she was supposed to be before her growth was stunted by all this trauma she experienced. And now she's like, yeah, she's expressing jealousy, she's lashing out, but it's showing that she has healed emotionally to this point, and that's a good thing. And like, if Messiah exists for no other reason than for that part of the movie, then like fine, because it is a really emotionally resonant aspect of her of Otoyo's healing process. But yeah, like all of the care that Kurosawa takes with this character, with her budding friendship with this little boy, and how much love and compassion that she is then shown to be capable of once she is healed. And like the continuation of that journey of healing others, of improving the world by improving the lives of those around you who are in it too. All of that is rendered so effectively, and it makes the stuff with Masai feel like, I don't get it, man. You know how human interaction works. You
Right.
know how human relationships work. You seem to have all this deep insight here. What gives over here?
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I think that's a good point to end on. I mean, I think my ultimate summation is that I'd have to watch it again to know whether or not I prefer it to Ikiru, but at this moment I'm leaning a little bit more towards Ikiru, although you've given me a lot of stuff to think about with it. Another thing is I think maybe this is maybe just a little bit too longer than it needed to be. I think we could have shaved away some stuff on the margins to cut it down to.
I don't disagree. They do at least give us an
They
intermission.
do, yes,
There's
yeah.
that. It's not like one of these modern 3 or 3.5 hour movies where there's no intermission. You're staying in your goddamn seat.
Yeah, that's one of the things. Like, if they're gonna have more of these 3-hour movies, then bringing back the intermission seems like a good idea.
Yeah, you can sell more concessions.
Exactly.
It seems like a no-brainer.
Absolutely. All right, Ian. Well, thanks so much for coming on, and why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, like I mentioned, I'm part of the We Made This network. I co-host a Star Trek show called We Are Starfleet. I co-host a show about the show Severance called Illumination Above All, an occasionally updating Star Wars show called The Way. I also pop up on Movieversaries, which is a movie kind of retrospective show where we look at films that have come out 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, 60 years ago. We covered Ikiru actually last year. Yeah, we just celebrate films on substantial anniversaries, and I'm a regular guest on that show. So if you like hearing me talk about movies, or think you might like hearing me talk about other things, just search for Ian Buckley on any of those shows or anywhere on the We Made This network, and I should pop up. I don't really do social media, unfortunately.
You're smarter than most of us.
Who are we kidding? Who are we kidding? It's fortunate. I don't know why I said unfortunately. That's a lie.
Yeah, you're definitely smarter than us.
Social media. I may at some point actually do some. I technically have a Blue Sky. I've never actually set it up, but I did get an invite, so I might do that at some point. But I'm not really anywhere else.
Okay. All right. Well, guys can check that stuff out in the show notes. As for us, japanonfilm.com is the website, Japan on Film on the socials. Mostly these days, that's Instagram, that's Blue Sky and Threads, not really so much on Twitter anymore. And if you're interested in my comic book project, which is still available, that's Paragons of Earth, and that is at crowdfunder.com/paragonscomic. That's crowdfunder.com/paragonscomic. So please go ahead and check that out. And as always, we are supported by the We Made This network, so listen up for what's coming up next after the credits. The Japan on Film podcast is produced by me, Perry Constantine, in conjunction with the We Made This podcast network. Visit japanonfilm.com for show notes, episodes, merchandise, and information about being a guest yourself. You can also reach out to me on the website's contact form if you have questions or comments about Japanese movies or the show itself. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at JapanOnFilm. If you'd like to help support the show, you can donate at japanonfilm.com, wemadethisnetwork.com, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find links with information about each guest and join the discussion on the We Made This Discord in the show notes of each episode. And now, listen to hear what's coming up next on the We Made This Network.
Three rings for the elven kings under the sky.
7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone.
9 for mortal men doomed to die.
1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne.
In the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. Welcome to One Rules Them All, a Lord of the Rings podcast on the We Made This podcast network. Myself, Luke Winch, and my co-host Baz Greenland will be exploring the new Amazon Prime series, The Rings of Power. Week by week, we should be analysing each episode with a foray of guests. We have also been revisiting the Peter Jackson films and looking at them from a new perspective. So join us every week as we discuss the world of Tolkien and the Rings of Power.
1 podcast to rule them all.
1 podcast to find them.
1 podcast to bring them all.
And on the We Made This network, bind them.
You know what's tricky sometimes? Predicting who is going to win at the Oscars. You have to get yourself to a cinema to see all of the movies, or at least have all the streaming services so you don't miss a single one. You have to pay attention to all the precursor awards to see who is winning so far. The Golden Globes, the BAFTAs, they're the pretty obvious ones. But don't forget the Critics' Choice Awards, or the SAGs, or the DGAs, or the PGAs, or the Eddies, or the Gothams, or the AFI Top 10, or the National Board of Review. Ugh, exhausting, right? Or you can just join me for Academy Watch on the We Made This podcast network. I'm the host, Bo Nicholson, and I've been reading the trends, keeping the stats, and watching as many of the films as humanly possible, and I can tell you who the big players will be on the big night. Me and a guest will also be dissecting one of the key movies in the award season each episode. This year, it looks like Oppenheimer's to lose in several categories, including Best Picture. But can a mid-year release maintain momentum right to a Best Picture victory 2 years in a row? Or can Poor Things or The Holdovers stage a late season surge to steal the prize? Is it too early to discount the cultural phenomenon that was Barbie? Or Martin Scorsese's late career masterpiece, Killers of the Flower Moon? And what about the critical darling Past Lives? Whatever the movements are across the various precursors and throughout the season, you'll have the best available information if you subscribe to Academy Watch, wherever you listen to podcasts.